The self-help industry is increasingly unhelpful, at least in my humble opinion. We have TikToks telling us to cold shower, meditate, exercise, don't exercise, journal 10 different ways. We have books outlining that you are definitely a failure if you wake up any later than 5 a.m. And there are podcasters who say that the only good relationship you can be in is one where every conversation you use to constantly align your goals with each other to make sure you are always crushing it. Otherwise, you're just letting each other down. Besides all of this advice being entirely stupid, the big issue for me with self-help is it is increasingly turning into a fast food style drive-through. We're expecting life-changing wisdom to be served up in 60-second sound bites in between cat videos, dance trends, and whatever sensationalist political weird stuff will end up in your feed. The self-help industry itself has exploded to a staggering 13.2 billion industry, and that was in 2022, where there was also 85,000 new self-help books published. On TikTok, the hashtag self-help gets over 25 billion views, and this all points to the fact that we are consuming more advice than ever. Yet, if you look at any research, you'll see that people report to be feeling more lost and confused about their personal development than any previous generation. So, hello and welcome to the show, where we're looking into the real science of self-improvement to help you build your own personal wisdom towards a life well lived, however you define it. Today, we're asking the question about self-help and if we're thinking about it all wrong. Instead of treating it like a buffet of quick fixes, can we approach it more like learning an instrument? A slow and thoughtful progression that takes a lot of self-practice in your own time with the occasional guidance from a teacher. You wouldn't expect to turn up to a music lesson and leave an hour later with a bunch of skills you didn't have before. Those skills all come from the practice you put in between the lessons. And that's exactly how we should think about wisdom. You can't just consume it, you have to spend most of your time practicing it. And so this episode is here to help you think about how and what content you should actually be consuming and how to go beyond just consuming wisdom and how to start cultivating it. It is going to be a good one, so stay tuned. Something very fascinating. For most of human history, what we now call self-help was deeply integrated into culture through philosophy, religion, and community wisdom. The ancient Greeks didn't have hashtag Stoic talk. They had actual philosophical schools where people spent years studying how to live well. Religious texts weren't quick fix manuals, but comprehensive guides for living that people spent their lifetime studying and discussing. If you look at Dr. Jonathan Haidt's research, it suggests that this shift from slow wisdom to fast advice might, perhaps, be actively harming our ability to grow. Our brains evolved to learn through stories, experiences, and deep reflection, not through rapid-fire tips and tricks. A further problem isn't just about the issue of patience versus instant gratification, but the fact that algorithms that govern our content consumption are actively pushing us towards shorter and more sensational content. It's certainly well documented that each reduction in content length leads to significantly higher engagement rates, which is why it happens, because it feels easier and like you're getting more for less. Actually, we could think of this like a race to the bottom of the brainstem, content that triggers quick emotional responses rather than thoughtful reflection. If you think about when you learned to ride a bike, you didn't watch a YouTube video and instantly master it. Yet somehow creators will fool us into thinking that personal growth works differently. Like their video will solve the whole thing for you. It won't. And you can see the exact same thing with business and money advice. Alex Hormozy, who sometimes does give good advice, his latest advert says stop doing business on hard mode, as if somehow reading his book will magically make everything completely easy. And sure, there might be some good advice in his books, and I'd say there is, but the biggest problem in business is expecting it to be easy. A problem you won't find in business is not having read one of Alex's books. It's certainly not going to be the end of the road for you. If we look at good old Dr. Carol Dweck's research on mindset and growth mindset, she really does show that allowing this idea of instant results and picking that up as a mentality, that really hinders our ability to learn and grow. We should think of our mind like a garden. You can't make a flower grow faster by pulling on it What you have to do is create the right conditions for growth. This is where Cal Newport's framework for personal development comes in and is going to be a big part of what I explain today. He suggests a 3-tiered approach that works with your brain's natural learning mechanisms and not against them. In general, I'm a big fan of Cal Newport's approach to deep work and slow productivity, and you won't be surprised that his systems for approaching self-help are just as good. So, how should we think about self-help? There's some really interesting research on a concept called narrative transportation that analyzes how our brains process information differently based on how it's presented to us. When we consume bite-sized social media content, it activates very different neural pathways than when we engage with longer form content that actually goes into depth. Cal Newport argues that there are 3 content types within self-help, and you can think of it a lot like food. Imagine you walk into a nutrition store. On one shelf, you have the carefully formulated supplements backed by research. On the other, you have candy bars with maybe some protein powder sprinkled on top. Both do technically contain nutrients, but they're hardly equivalent. And this is like our current self-help landscape. So on that, we can break down the 3 content types. Firstly, we have social media and short content, and that's the self-help equivalent of a candy bar. If you go for a binge of reels or Instagram quotes, they may be very entertaining. They might even be full of wisdom, but these quick hits are really activating what psychologists call the novelty-seeking reward pathway, and they really don't engage deeper learning centers, and you will forget most of it, and you certainly won't be implementing it. It feels good in the moment and easy to consume, and you get the little hit of, ooh, this could change everything in my life. But the retention rate is just abysmal. Studies show that we get well over 90% of social media content within 24 hours of consuming it. It's definitely on the candy bar level of nutrition for your brain. Temporarily satisfying, ultimately unfulfilling. Then you have longer form content pieces like blogs, newsletters, podcasts. These can be thought of like a protein shake. Longer form audio allows for what psychologists call flow state, a deeper level of engagement where some real learning does happen. When you engage in podcasts or a well-written article instead of short clips, you'll notice something interesting. The ideas can stick around longer. It's a bit like having a guest over for dinner who sticks around and helps cleaning up afterwards instead of rushing off. But it's still not the same as a real relationship, and if these forms of content are like a protein shake, you definitely don't want to get all your calories from liquid food. It can be good and better than a candy bar, but you don't want to rely on them only. Finally, we have books. The full meal, the meat and potatoes. Research shows that deep reading activates multiple brain regions simultaneously, creating strong neural pathways for learning that is ultimately what we're seeking if we're engaging in self-help. Also, there's something about the fact that we are completely still sitting and reading a book means that we activate our imagination more strongly to visualize the world that we're reading about, which is an extra bonus compared to listening, where we carry on doing things and we're walking around, we're engaging stuff, and we don't have such ample space in our brain for actively imagining and playing with the concepts that we're learning about. It's the difference between looking at a picture of a landscape and walking through it. And I can give you a concrete example to fill out these 3 ideas. You could take the concept of habit formation. On TikTok, you might get a 20-second clip telling you to just do the same thing for 21 days to form your habit. On the podcast, you might learn much more in depth about the cue, routine, reward cycle, and some more in-depth studies of how to implement this for different habits you're trying to make. But then you'll have a book like Charles Duhigg's The Power of Habit, which is the full feast. All the science, all the stories to put them together, strategies to help you implement these habits, and a deep exploration of the subtle nuances that make real change possible. And you can see that if you really want to learn how habits work and change your habits, why you'd rather read a book than watch a TikTok. And as I mentioned earlier, we forget 90% of what we consume on social media. But with books, after a week, we can still remember 65% of the big concepts. Yet if you look at the average human these days, the average person spends about 147 minutes daily on social media, whilst only spending 16.8 minutes reading. And this is definitely a problem that hopefully I inspire you to change your own stats towards something better. Another of my favorite writers, Gowinder, has stated that we are living in the infobesity crisis. Cal Newport talks about the concept of ultra-processed content. And the take-home from these ideas is that we need to get off social media in quick hits of information and slow down and actually digest what we're consuming. Okay, now let's move away from content that is directly labeled as self-help and talk about the benefits of fiction and autobiographies. The book Wild Swans by Jing Chang, for example, is a memoir spanning 3 generations of Chinese women. Many readers have claimed it completely changed their approach to career decisions, family relationships, and personal resilience. But that isn't just a nice anecdote, it's backed by fascinating science. Research has shown that when we immerse ourselves in the stories of others, it can literally rewire our brains. When we read about someone climbing a mountain, our motor cortex activates. When we read about emotional pain, our empathy centers light up. It's like having a flight simulator for life experiences, and it's called interpersonal learning. It's vastly different from traditional self-help, and instead of someone telling you, here's what you should do, this is how you should do it, you get to form your own opinions by experiencing life through someone else's eyes. The concept of narrative transportation shows us that character-driven stories consistently cause oxytocin release in our brains, which is the chemical that enhances empathy and understanding. So not only are stories a much more powerful way for us to remember things, as we are humans that learn through stories rather than instructions, stories are actually more implementable for us in our lives and a better tool for self-help. Of course, we have different personal tastes, and the key to find the things that help you learn is to analyze what resonates with you and try different things. If you find yourself deeply moved by a documentary or a memoir, well, that's great. And it wasn't just entertainment. It was your brain trying on new ways of being, testing different perspectives in a safe environment. Probably my favorite book that changed my life more than any other and inspired me to get out the door and go on the biggest adventures that I have done was a book by Alistair Humphreys about his own journey cycling around the world. It's called Mood of Future Joys, and at no point does he give you any advice on what you should do with your life, and it would not be considered a self-help book. It's just a book about one guy and all the different problems he has as he travels around the world. And it's really brilliant, and he's a great speaker, and I did have him on the show last year if you want to hear him talking. Another of my favorite books that I probably reread more than any others, because it's quite short but I find very hard-hitting, is Siddhartha. It follows a short story of a single man's life from boyhood to death and the very human struggles that he fights with and learns to accept. And I find it really grounds me and makes me rethink about my life in ways that most self-help books don't. In general, biographies of incredible scientists and adventurers, probably my favorite thing. And I want to really emphasize the fact that humans learn through stories. And so it makes so much more sense to spend more time reading stories than it does reading instructions. Part of this realization within myself is why I'm starting my next podcast that I'm launching next year, covering the world's most impactful world changers and innovators. As I just said, I really like scientists and adventurers that have done crazy stuff. And so I'm going to be telling all their stories. So I'm going to be telling all of their stories and hopefully how you can also learn to change the world from the people that have come before us. But anyway, I will say there is something especially good about books that follow a whole life story or even multiple life stories over several generations, like the book Wild Swans that I mentioned earlier. I have been asked to give more book recommendations on the show. So as they have been asked for, I can also recommend the book Pachinko that I found incredible. It follows multiple generations of a family escaping North Korea during the World Wars to Japan, and then following the generations up until the modern day. And it's amazing how incredibly different and hard the struggles are of each generation and the problems they face, and then how the generation that comes after them is completely unbothered by the last generation's problems, and yet they face equally difficult and hard to explain problems themselves. And it's very humanizing and kind of calming to realize that whatever you're going through now is unique and important, but also it'll be fine and the world will continue to spin and life will go on. Some other great books that have a similar arc over several life stories are a book by Khalid Hosseini called And the Mountains Echoed. Replay by Ken Grimwood is a really good fiction novel that follows a man who dies at 43 and wakes up again at 18, and he keeps on reliving his life in different ways. It's a bit like a whole life version of Groundhog Day, and a similar one to that as well is Midnight Library by Matt Haig, about a woman who goes to a library and experiences several lives. And again, really brilliant and full of narrative transportation for your mind. So that's probably enough book recommendations for today, and we will go on to a short advert break before coming back with the second half of the episode. So you'll remember that we spoke about self-help coming in 3 forms: the candy bars like social media posts and reels, protein shakes and snacks like podcasts and blogs, and then we have the meat and potatoes of a full book. Well, we can make a similar extrapolation with similar parallels to just the general self-help topics. As I've said, we have the direct self-help itself, which is honestly a bit more on the candy bar end. Then we have the interpersonal learning that we spoke about last, where we learn through full life stories and narrative transportation. That's more like your protein shake or nutritious snack. And lastly, we have the meat and potatoes, the intimidating philosophical, theological, scientific texts that really help you shape what your beliefs are, how you think about life, the universe, and everything within it. Research on wisdom has suggested that engaging with philosophical and theological texts activates what is called reflective judgment, our ability to grasp complex, contradictory ideas. It's like upgrading your mental operating system, which is, of course, why you read self-help. And when we do this, we really start standing on the shoulders of giants. And yes, it can seem intimidating and many never try. But here's the thing. You don't need to start with Kant's critique of pure reason. You can think of it like learning to swim. You don't need to start in the deep end. When it comes to wisdom development, we can do what's called scaffolded learning. Start with modern authors or podcasters interpreting ancient wisdom, then gradually work back towards the source materials. For example, you could begin with Ryan Holiday's writing about Stoicism, and maybe the Practical Stoicism podcast. Then you can move to Marcus Aurelius's Meditations in a Modern Translation. And then eventually you can move up to tackling some of the harder original philosophical Stoic texts. This ramp-up approach works because it aligns with how our brains naturally build understanding. Our expertise develops through 3 stages: acclimation, competence, and then finally proficiency. And you can't actually skip these steps. For example, I really enjoyed learning more about Buddhism, and I didn't start with the Pali Canon, which are the collection of scriptures considered to be the authoritative foundational texts of the oldest form of Buddhism. I started with modern mindfulness books and podcasts, progressed to more scholarly, in-depth things like reading about the evolutionary psychology of Buddhism, writings from the Dalai Lama, Goenka, Alan Watts, and eventually studied some of the original texts as well themselves. Each step built upon the last one, creating a deeper understanding that gives you the ability to then understand the next level up, in the same way that you need to learn your timetables before jumping into the geometry of rocket flight. And if you are looking for some very nice entry-level Buddhism, I can really recommend the Dalai Lama's Cat as a super fun book that really contains a lot of the core basic Buddhism precepts wrapped up in some very easy stories and give you some empathy for the mind of a cat. But maybe you want to learn something completely different. Perhaps you want to learn about the universe. Well, on YouTube, you could watch Kyrgyzstan and Veritasium, and they're really great. Then you have things like Richard Feynman's book, 6 Easy Pieces, which is a fantastically well-written book on the most important concepts of physics. It genuinely made me see the world a bit differently when I read it. And then you might want to progress on something like Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time. And finally, if you're still enjoying it and want to go further, you can jump into the real deep end and go for like Newton's Principia Mathematica, maybe some of Einstein's papers, and of course, use some supplementary commentary to help you dig into them properly. And that's how you build real wisdom that changes how you think in the long term. And it's a project, it might take a year, but you're going to get a lot more from it than just watching TikTok every day for the year, because at the end of that year, your life won't be very much different. And I gave the examples of Buddhism and understanding the universe, but you could do the exact same thing for economics and the history of money and Bitcoin, or maybe communism, or the philosophy of consciousness. The world is your oyster, and there is a lot of really good content out there that will aid you to help yourself, and they might not directly be called self-help. Regardless, whatever it is, it won't give you instant results, and it won't be completely easy, but it will give you much deeper and longer lasting changes in your thinking patterns and change how you navigate the world, which of course is the point of consuming self-help in the first place. A self-help TikTok or podcast on how to get rich will do a lot less for you than putting the time and effort into understanding the history of money, which will teach you vastly more about how to think about money and use it as the tool that it is, instead of looking for stupid hacks to somehow radically change your bank account numbers. And one last point here is that I would really recommend the value of the habit of seeking diversity in your information from different viewpoints and ideally from different perspectives across the world. For example, Western self-help often feels like a marathon runner just shouting at you to run faster. But if you step into Eastern wisdom and their traditions, you might hear questions such as, why are you running at all? Different cultures don't just have different answers, they have different questions. And if you look at Western and Eastern cultures, it's actually been shown that they perceive reality differently. Western minds tend to focus on individual objects, whilst Eastern minds tend to naturally see relationships and contexts. And that's not just academic, it fundamentally shapes how we can approach personal growth. For instance, American self-help might focus on crushing your goals, whilst Japanese concepts like Kaizen, which is about continuous small improvements, or Ikigai, finding your life purpose, they offer a gentler and more holistic approach. And so when you're consuming anything, I think it's great to weave together different perspectives that create a much richer tapestry of understanding. It's like having both a microscope and a telescope. You really need the two together to see the full picture of the world around you. Okay, now we have covered how to think about self-help beyond just the limitations of the defined genre of self-help, and how to more widely find and digest content that will help your own self. You can imagine personal growth like building a house. Firstly, you want to clear out the junk in your house. That is social media. It's just tacky garbage that you don't need in your house at all. And then from the bottom up, you want strong foundations. That's our scholarly wisdom that provides structure in how we navigate our day-to-day life and our decisions and who we are. Then we have the rooms. That's our interpersonal learning. You have relationships, your health, workplay, adventure. As such, you might want a games room, a relaxing room, an office, a gym, a bedroom, etc. And in each case, you want to be reading deep stories about these topics that let you try on different ways of being. Which of the rooms in your house you want to spend the most time in? Do you want to spend most of your hours in your office, or do you want to spend more time in the games room and hanging out? And seeing how different people's lives have led them to be in one place or another helps you understand how your choices will affect your own life. And then finally, in your house, you have the furniture. That is the more pre-digested content like your podcasts and blogs and news sources that you might sit in. Of course, you can sit in day to day and be part of your daily habits. And based on some cognitive learning research, we can develop a really balanced approach to the way we consume content. At a daily level, you should have 2 to 3 high-quality newsletters or podcasts, and definitely delete the addictive self-help social media accounts. Then at a weekly level, you should try to be reading 1 chapter of a memoir or watch a thoughtful documentary that really helps you try on some different perspectives on life. At a monthly level, you should try and read 1 well-researched self-help book, or a book on history or science or economics, etc. And finally, at the quarterly level, you should try to be tackling 1 foundational concept, like a foundational text. Like I said earlier, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. That wouldn't be something you just pick up and consume. That would be like a 3-month project where you listen to some podcasts about Kant, you perhaps read some easier books first, and then you work your way up to the final foundational text. If you follow this cadence over a year, you'll really notice some huge improvements into how you see the world and how you make your own decisions. Of course, the other thing that really goes with this is the integration and keeping a journal for your wisdom. Not just for like random notes, but more for connecting dots between different sources. When Marcus Aurelius' thoughts on morality align with a modern memoir about loss, you can write that down. When ancient Buddhist ideas about mindfulness show up in some research on neuroscience, you can make that connection. Yes, it's kind of slow. This isn't about speed learning, it's about very deep connections that stick with you. Ideally, what you want to move towards is trying to regurgitate what you're learning, and writing blogs or teaching other people about these concepts will get you to the most advanced level of understanding them. At that point, I really wouldn't worry about too much volume. What you really want to be thinking about is the quality in what you know, and actually accept that you know a lot less than you think you do. These days, we're so pushed to have an opinion on everything, yet we're not anywhere nearly informed enough to actually have a good opinion. And I'd really recommend my recent podcast on non-player characters if you want to learn more about that. Anyway, on the concept of actually focusing more on quality rather than quantity, I would in fact argue that it can be damaging to consume too much information. Derek Sivers has a beautiful chapter in his new book, Useful Not True. It's about the issue of overwhelming yourself with information, and especially of the self-help genre. He gives the example that when you give a computer a heavy, difficult program to run, it'll start working and it takes some time. Let's say you're exporting a video or installing new software. If you interrupt the computer with new instructions on that task, it has to start the task all over again. And if you keep giving it new information, it can never finish its job. He says that these days, so many people are lost and running in circles, and they all have one thing in common. They say that they keep listening to podcasts, reading books, watching videos, doing courses, taking in more and more information, and they still don't know what to do. And it seems kind of obvious. They're drowning in the sea of self-help content and trying to drink the sea dry to save themselves, instead of just swimming to dry land and taking a break from it. You can only take in so much information and hear so many different instructions and opinions. At some point, you have to stop the input and run the program. Stop interrupting yourself with new information. Execute one plan of action and see it through to fruition. It's honestly so damaging for you. And just like Derek Sivers, I'll agree, I've spoken to lots of people that have exactly this problem, that they're overwhelmed by too many different opinions, that they have no idea what to take action on. When it comes to any advice, I think it's just damaging. You can look at cryptocurrency, for example. There's so many influencers out there that are making content of what new coin is exploding. And if you stay in the world of watching crypto news, you'll be constantly buying and selling different things and essentially lose all of your money to fees and making the odd bad decision, or maybe lots of bad decisions. Instead, yes, you should perhaps immerse yourself in how cryptocurrencies work, the history of the blockchain, history of Bitcoin cycles, monetary policy, learn about how the psychology of gambling and speculation plays into different sectors, and then make your bets if you want to, and just leave and let your plan execute. When you take in more and more information, it makes you a worse investor. Or perhaps back to the musician example, if you want to learn the piano and your teacher teaches you to play the major scale, you need to spend all week practicing that scale. You don't need to research a new scale every day. If you were to do that, at the end of the week, you wouldn't be able to play anything. And that's why endless new information is actively harmful, and why self-help is so annoying when it keeps promising that one short thing will be the key to success, and all your problems in your life are because you don't yet have this one key piece of information yet. Like, just don't believe the hype and tune out and start focusing on real growth. Okay, now let's recap. Remember, the goal isn't to become a walking encyclopedia of self-help knowledge. As Alan Watts beautifully put it, you don't look at a flower to necessarily understand it. You look at the flower to become more like the flower. So read more widely and read things that interest you, and take on some hard topics. And you can start small, even just this week. Choose one quality podcast to replace your social media. Pick up a memoir that calls to you, and then select one modern interpretation of some classical wisdom. You can let some quicker tips inform your daily choices, but let the stories shape your perspective and let the wisdom and traditions ground your understanding. Your journey through self-help content should feel less like cramming for an exam and more like learning to see in color after a lifetime of black and white. It's not about speed, and it is all about depth. In the end, true personal growth isn't about hacking your morning routine or optimizing your productivity. It's just about becoming more human and living with more purpose. And that is worth taking the time to do right. The future of self-help is probably going in the direction of shorter content and quicker fixes, and it's not going to help. Your future should be about deeper learning, where you don't just consume wisdom, you learn to cultivate it. And on that, thank you for listening. I hope this has given you a new framework to view the world of content with and how to navigate it for true personal growth. If you were to feel like sharing it with someone or sticking a good review on the show, that would be a fantastic way to spread some joy this Christmas. And remember, we know that if you overeat, you have to work twice as hard to stay healthy. It's much the same with content, especially when you eat intellectual junk food. It's better to have less. With all this content out there, consumption is the sole purpose of its production. It's not necessarily there to help you, it's there to make money from you. So choose wisely. Sure, something might look tasty and appealing. There's only so much you can take in, and you need to rest and digest. So take it easy. Remember, not just to consume wisdom, but to also cultivate it. Thank you so much for listening.
Go you!
Your consistency to reach the end of an episode is legendary.
My hero!
But when we learn things, it's important to reflect. So I politely invite you to take a pause, rifle through the biggest ideas you just heard. So here's your opportunity to hit pause and have a think. Okay, did you wrestle with some insights? Information doesn't stick when we race from one podcast to the next without using our brain to play with the knowledge. So here's another go at a pause. Alright, righty. I'll let you off to continue with your life now. If you have any ideas or feedback for the show, I'm always interested to hear from you.
You're the best!
And other than that, please stay curious. Curious. Growing. Smiling for no reason.